to our fourth episode, Deconstructing PI Planning. Today we are going to spend our entire time digging into Principle 6, which is make value flow without interruptions. And the reason we want to spend so much time on this today is that, one, there's a whole bunch of sub-principles, which we'll go through one at a time, the different principles of achieving flow. And two, in many ways, PI planning is the place where you're basically setting yourself up to either achieve flow during your PI or not. And the implications of how you make the decisions and what choices you make during PI planning, frankly, fundamentally alter how the PI is going to play out, whether you'll see flow or whether you'll see a big pile of teams waiting on each other to satisfy dependencies. I am excited to be joined yet again by Stephan and Yuval, and I think we're going to dive right in. So as we look into this principle, so we look at Visualize and Limit WIP as the first piece of flow. Yuval, do you want to give us a brief summary of how PI planning helps set us up for success with that?
Yeah, sure. I'll start with just a broad remark on the fact that there are multiple sub-principles in Principle 6. When I teach people this principle, I give it as an example of a big batch versus a smaller batch. There are a couple of things going on here. One of the things to think about is that each one of these sub-principles could actually on its own bring a lot of value. So if we look at visualizing and limiting WIP, work in process, even this principle on its own, when you apply it to the way you're working, can bring a lot of value. Can bring transparency to how many things are we taking on, as well as start to shape the demand. Like we're shaping agility. The purpose of this sub-principle is to shape the demand to our actual capacity. And when we think about this in the context of the PI, before we even talk about PI planning, like you said, the PI planning is setting us up for success in the PI. What does that look like? That looks like teams, visualizing and limiting the amount of work that they're doing at their team level, managing their stories in their backlogs, but also, and maybe even more important when we're talking about scale, the art, visualizing and limiting the amount of work that it's doing. So features and enablers, how many of them do we have running in progress? That's happening during PI execution. So what's the importance of PI planning in this context? PI planning should give us as much of a preview, let's say, about how our WIP might look like throughout the PI as possible, and kind of tease us to improve and shape the flow. If we think about a CFD, a cumulative flow diagram, as a retrospective view of how work flowed throughout a time period, let's say the PI, there's an opportunity in the PI planning to do that ahead of time, to do some sort of flow future perspective by looking at WIP.
Flow future perspective. That sounds like a really powerful technique. Have you run that in practice anywhere?
I didn't call it that. I just came up with the language, but the actual to do it without calling it that, yes. Not necessarily in PI planning, but I often do that when I go into an organization and have a conversation with them about how their flow looks, and we whip up, a Kanban board that looks like their value stream, and I ask them to kind of imagine how flow might look like week by week as they go through their next release, their next quarter. It typically creates some intense feelings from people once they understand how bad their flow might look like. So it can be a powerful conversation. And I guess, when we look at the art planning board, it kind of gives us some of that information. We just need to have these conversations and structure them around what does this tell us about our WIP. It's not an ideal tool for that, but it can be adjusted to be.
Say something.
Yeah, may I jump in? listening to you, Val, we're talking about make value flow without interruptions for the PI, but the PI planning itself should have a value flow without interruptions as well, right? So for me, that's two levels. One is the meta level of PI planning over those 2 days or 3 days. And the other one is make value flow without interruptions when you go into execution mode. And some of my notes I took are more geared towards the 2 days or the 3 days of the structure of the flow through the structure of the agenda.
Chain of logic back that our goal, our ultimate goal is for the customer to receive the best possible value, which is kind of business flow in one sense. Like we have amazing operations and it's always delivering more value to the customers, so they want to spend more, we get more customers, we expand to new markets, whatever our strategy is for that product. To do that, our development value stream needs to continuously deliver with ever more flow, and we want to see value flow without interruptions to improve the business. And to do that, in each individual event, each individual ceremony, we want to see the value of that event align and flow to the best of its ability to serve the greater flow. But probably worth noting that if there's ever a trade-off, the one further out should win. Like if you need to stop your event to better create flow for the PI, please do so. If you need to destroy flow for your teams to better get flow for your customer and better real-world flow, you probably should do so. Like, say production goes down, you don't blindly continue your plan, you get the business back up and running. So in many cases, I think the outer flow wins. But
That's interesting.
But just seeing this idea of a network of value streams or contributors to that ultimate flow, all of them should flow, but all of them in service to the one that they serve and subordinate to that in many cases.
As you're talking through that, I'm reminded of the lean decision filter that David Anderson came up with. Value trumps flow trumps elimination of waste. I think it's a very similar concept. You want to see flow. Sometimes in order to see flow, you're willing to take on some waste. Waste, for example, in the form of we're elaborating stories maybe a bit earlier than we would otherwise, and we'll get to that later on today. And sometimes there would be something that's so valuable that you would be willing to disrupt your flow for it.
And I'd forgotten about that, but clearly you and I were both influenced by it over the years. Perhaps that's more kind of just intuitive at this point and not something I pull out as a maxim. But it's really helpful because I've noticed that anytime you get a group of overthinking engineers and or coaches together, you can almost make any activity turn into a waste conversation. Like you can decide that coding is waste. You can decide that like anything is wasted if you squint at it hard enough and long enough. And that flips around to the real question, which is what creates the most flow. So how does visualizing and limiting WIP then contribute towards that goal? Let's give the obvious answer here.
I mean, visualizing, if you can't see it, you can't improve it, I would say. Just by seeing stuff, you get some ideas on how to improve the flow. You see stuff that's stuck. You see whether work looks like a swamp or a river, and you have an opportunity to make it more like a river. And explicitly by limiting WIP would be an even higher maturity level of that.
I've actually flipped it around in a lot of my conversations, and instead of saying limiting WIP, which is a tool, I say create focus. Because lack of focus, it's very easy to see how it's crippling.
But for me, visualizing is also the basis then for all the steering throughout the PI, the collaboration, and onboarding those people who then, based on an art planning board, can collaborate with us, focus with us, no matter when they're on board, when they're off board. And that's where I get the glowing eyes of PI planning, right? That's really where the magic happens.
Everybody seeing things, everybody focusing together creates the value. I don't think we're going to ever argue with this. Where do we see it go wrong, though? Like, where do people mess this one up where it cripples them and they don't see flow because of something tied to the first flow accelerator?
One of the things I've observed now and then is when you go into the breakout sessions, that teams again try to locally optimize, plan their work, although they visualize, although they talk about certain dependencies. What is the bigger focus over a few teams and kind of gathering around the item you are planning now, right? So to visualize this in the process of visualizing what we are planning, what are the dependencies, it's kind of crucial as well. And seeing that during the breakout session is a good indicator. And if you don't see it, that's the point where I then try to bring in the team coaches, me as a coach, RTs, even management or the product managers, going there and asking, what's the focus? What are you doing now? And how do you visualize that? Because a lot of heads around, a lot in their brain, I can't see it.
The thing I see most often go wrong is just not paying any attention to this throughout PI planning. Like, people don't even think about this. I admit, even I don't always think about it. There's so much stuff to pay attention to during PI planning. The flow of the PI planning itself, that it's hard to keep in mind, flow throughout the PI itself.
This is one of those places where I see having a facilitator of the event who is different than the coach of the system becomes really helpful. Because I know when I'm focused on facilitation, a lot of my time is spent focusing on who's talking to whom, and are the people in the right place, and how many minutes do we have until we're supposed to get everybody together again, and here. That fills the brain pretty completely. And when I'm not facilitating, when I'm not at PI planning, I spend most of my time looking at the boards and watching social posts. And it's like, wow, there's a lot of registering going to that team, or this team seemed one of the directly relevant. I remember a conversation in a multi-training. It was a solution planning with 5 release trainings, and there's one team and one of the foundation platform, basically the platform training, trying to anonymize the flagger and slow harder. And I just remember looking at their board and thinking, wow, they have a piece of like 40 different features that's PI for 3 different release trains. And I just asked one of the directors nearby, I was like, hey, how does that team deliver? How reliable are they? Just like, oh, they always miss. I'm like, is anybody flagging this as a risk? And he had that moment of like, but I don't want them to feel bad, but you're right, we can't afford to not name this. And he went over, he was a great guy. He's one of the execs I love to work with time and time again. And he just went over and sat down with them and chatted for a couple minutes. And he's like, he came away, he's like, yeah, they're willing to admit it now. And he never made an incident about it, but suddenly at the next readout, they're like, hey, we're going to have to move some of this work off, or we're going to disappoint these 7 teams. And everybody else's eyes went wide, and they're like, this team's never said that before. And no, yeah, they're right. We know this is going to happen. And then a lot of huge risk to disappear from the board just because he made it safe for them to talk about it. And it was basically a WIP conversation. We didn't use the lingo, but it was basically that.
I like what you just mentioned, Eric. It's differentiating between moderating and coaching and this observing. I like that, because coaching, training business owners, that's something I do sometimes as well. I say, okay, after the context, let's step back and observe. And then asking them, what would you do now? Where do you go to get your information, to create focus, to read an art planning board, or to see the first hour nothing happens on that board? That's an indication. And I would even add a third party here that really is observing from the viewpoint or the perspective of what is the focus from value delivery finally, when we then go into execution mode. The 2 days help us set it up, And I, as a manager, as a business owner, responsible for value, should then really be in that mode that you just described. I like that.
I was careful with my words because I wasn't coaching the leaders. My language is coaching the system. And that is I don't have a formal role. I don't have to be attached to any one person. I'm not attached to the program or the flow of the event or the facilitation. And being able to roam and wander and just observe where appropriate, but also intervene where I feel appropriate as well. The closest I can come to is coaching the system instead of coaching a person or a team or a leadership or a triad or what have you. And sometimes that just means sitting, for part of that event, it was a 4-day event because there were 5 or 6 release trains and it was crazy. But part of that was just sitting in the hallway in a big window with my legs up and watching the solution board and watching the amount of traffic between rooms because every release train had their own ballroom in this long hallway. And that was me checking on collaboration for a while. I didn't know what I was doing until I watched it for a while. I'm like, oh yeah, I know why it's important to be up here now. But I was able to just kind of flow with the use of the system.
I guess the question that's running, that I'm trying to think about as you're talking, Eric, is how could we systemize some of that coaching? How could we improve the artifacts that we use? How could we improve the guidance of PI planning itself to make it more likely that these sort of insights, that these sort of coaching moments happen without having, somebody coaching the system as a separate concern? Of course, that's a great idea, but is there something, I see, for example, the art board, the solution board, as something that should help us see flow. Is it currently helping us see flow? One specific example is, if you look at the art board, the features show up when they're supposed to be delivered, right? It doesn't show when you're starting to work on them. So in a sense, it's not really showing you the WIP unless you use a different style of board. Is that something that, we should recommend? Should we use beyond red yarn, also use green yarn or whatever that flows to the left all the way to the point that this team is starting to work on something to reflect work in process? Just as an idea that I've tried a couple of times.
It's Eric, and I'm an agile coach, and I use Gantt charts. And I'm not actually joking. I find a little bit of a Gantt view of how long does this WIP intend to be in process is incredibly valuable. And it's not the tool of Gantt chart that's inherently evil. It's how they're misused for moving resources from place to place and destroying the efficacy of teams. And when I put a Gantt chart together that I'm using to almost like a CFD, it's really just a flavor of a CFD at that point. With specific features still named, it's remarkably useful to see exactly what you're describing and draw the dependencies in terms of stories and tasks between them. And oh wow, that tool's been around 20 years longer. It's not wrong. It's just, let's recast it as a useful tool in a modern light and maybe attempt to avoid all the misuses while we're at it.
I hear you, Yuval, what you said, but instead of kind of adding more stuff and prescribing more stuff, it's about visualizing. And for me, the mantra is always do ever or whatever is helpful to better visualize, to better see where we should have better collaboration, as Eric said, that the system really works, right? So for me, it's kind of a fine line. How much should be in PI planning guidance? Sometimes, I struggle as well. Is it good enough? On the other hand, hey, we've got knowledge workers, we've got thinking people. They should be able to bring it forward and to visualize, and not to come into PI planning. That's a static setup. It's an evolving setup. And I would use the word, let's evolve that stuff when it happens in that context.
I don't know if this changes the guidance to answer your question, but I realized as I was listening and reflecting, this is how I use leadership during the event. Like, my goal is usually to get the directors, the people that don't have like formal triad roles or formal business owner roles, but the kind of the leaders that many of the people on the training report to, acting in this kind of system coach role so that they're the ones maintaining the health and flow, taking ownership over the effectiveness of the spend effectively. Like, it's no longer about flow of work, it's about the efficiency of how you're spending money and are you getting the best outcomes for the money you're spending this release train, which is its own type of flow.
I guess this is a good opportunity to reflect back on the fact that we're talking about principles here. So yes, does it make sense to change the default PI planning guidelines? Maybe, maybe not, whatever. But what's important is that for leaders who are thinking about PI planning, that are facilitating PI planning, that are reflecting on how, their PI planning could be better supportive of a highly effective PI where value flows, we want these people to be thinking about, are we seeing the workflow? How are we seeing the potential of work to flow, or the potential for swamps and waterfall and all other flow dysfunctions that might happen during the PI? We talk about a lot of flow properties in SAFe. Are we equipped to actually think about these flow properties as part of PI planning? And what tools we use for that? We can use multiple tools, but the question is, are we thinking about flow?
I think that's a great summary. Any, as we look again at Visualise and Limit WIP, any other gotchas or improvements or advice you have for practitioners before we move on to addressing bottlenecks?
I'm good.
I'm fine.
So Stephan, I think I'll toss this towards you. I'm going to talk for 10 seconds so you're ready. As we look at the second flow principle of address bottlenecks, how do we see that show up in PI planning? How does it help? And what can we do to use that to create flow better?
That's an interesting flow accelerator, right? Address bottlenecks. If you don't do it, you're not systemically working on the system, because every system has this bottleneck. And if you don't find it, you're probably working on the wrong stuff. And I think PI planning allows that, unless you do it. And that's probably one of my critiques about the agenda and even the breakout sessions, that we probably, from my experience, don't surface those bottlenecks early enough. It's always a little bit delayed, right? Art planning board comes late. So finally, after the breakout session, we then address it, we use it for management review meeting. And my question is, how can we better address, or before we address bottlenecks, how can we surface them? Is it also probably some preparational work that should make sure that we have them on the plate when we go into the breakout session, so that the collaboration really flows and we have to swarm around those bottlenecks?
It drives to the first obvious risk factor here is if you see bottlenecks happening, and they can be very visible on the board if you use the right string, and you just ignore them. Yuval, I think you're about to speak.
May I quickly add to that one, what you just said, Eric, right? People, and I see that quite often, they were trained and they think, okay, the red thread is up there, done, next one, right? Instead of talking about it and really addressing it. And if you have a bottleneck, how about options? How about already starting a mitigation dialogue? How will we deal with that if it really happens?
Jumping to another risk factor or thing that happens, people often, if they don't ignore the bottleneck, they treat it at the surface level. The minimum intervention that's needed to think that they've addressed the bottleneck, they don't really elevate the bottleneck. They don't really subordinate other teams or decisions to the bottleneck that they recognize. I think it's very useful and powerful in general to look at, Goldratt's 5 focusing steps when thinking about bottlenecks. I don't see people doing that often, so that's a coaching tool that I like to use with people. I think in general you can look at tactical bottleneck, a tactical view on addressing bottlenecks, which is things we can do within this PI, moving some stuff around. And there's systemic or strategic elevation of bottlenecks, which would be things like, let's create some more capability in that area. Let's, ask a team to go into an area that they're not the best in, that would require some architectural runway, enablement, capacity that would currently take away from doing feature work, but over time, it's worthwhile to create this option, considering the amount of investment we see in that area. The one other thought is that there might be bottlenecks in PI planning itself. So just as a logistical thing, I recall that a client I worked with where, at some point we concluded that having only one, restroom stall for a whole agile release train was, an actual bottleneck. And if you think about during PI planning, if you're counting on breaks across the teams, it might be as simple as there's so much time that is being wasted by people queuing up for lunch, for whatever. So, that's just an extreme case, but, we've been, I would say that us real, flow people, we see flow problems everywhere at this point, right? We're allergic to flow issues. And we sometimes go to those events and notice some things.
Reminds me of the many years, I think, where Carl Scotland and Chris Matz, myself, and a couple others took over the bag stuffing and worked with the volunteers at the other conference for years, just because it was a beautifully fun flow problem to play with. How do you get over 2,000 bags stuffed with the right vendor materials, high quality, maximum speed, and did Kaizen, and we made it a learning experience for everybody involved. I think you were there for a couple of years.
Yep, and I remember the Imperial Garden copycat lunch at the Lean Kanban conferences.
Yep.
Limiting the amount of people in the lunch area.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting looking at that idea of tactical versus strategic, because there's such a wide range and ability to misuse this, but I love that you brought the 5 focusing steps into it. Identify the constraint, exploit the constraint, coordinate and synchronize to the constraint, elevate the constraint, and then repeat with the new constraint. And you kind of hit the subordinate, you hit the elevate. In Agile, we don't like to talk about exploit the constraint very much, though. And because it kind of looked like that team working overtime, or that team being put under stress, or variations of not great for the people on that team, but important for the overall system. And I remember one event where the virtual architecture team became the constraint in a big way. And one of the outcomes of PI planning was we invited the remote members of that architecture team to stay on site for the next 3 weeks until they unblocked the rest of the train. And they were working 12-hour days, and yes, there was catering and all that provided, but that sucks. But it was the thing blocking 400 other people, because it was the full solution. So how do we think about exploiting a constraint in the context of those being humans in an agile environment?
Wouldn't that also mean, Eric, that exploiting the constraint that we see during planning adds other stories and features? So the willingness to really adapt your prepared art and team backlogs. And I see that often as a a point for the teams. No. We prepared it. We know what we do. Let's plan it, right? Instead of already thinking about how do you plan for this exploitation of bottlenecks we already can anticipate.
I guess for me, if you have to consider exploiting a constraint, doing it with everybody in the room, with the people involved, rather than doing it to them, is a more humane approach that also gives you some optionality for, one option is to exploit that constraint and do that with the team. Maybe there are other options. Let's use the fact that we're all here to think through these options.
The one good thing that I can remember came out of that one is while it was inflicted on, it was like 5 out of the 15 members of that extended architecture team, it was inflicted, but because of the way it was identified in the large room with the clarity of the everything visualized around it, we were able to say what resolving it looked like with clarity. So that instead of it being a month, which was the original back of the envelope, it ended up being more like a week and a half of poor experience. So at least there was some containment that came along with having the clarity of knowing what was being unlocked and what success looked like. And they were able to say, you know what? We know one of the outcomes in the room during those 2 weeks was we're used to producing these high-res diagrams. We would never share them earlier, but recognizing who's waiting, they prioritized which things they were creating. They put out more, I'll say more sketch-like. They still weren't comfortable with sketches. But they were able to address the bottleneck in a much more intelligent way. And they got to points like, we can formalize these diagrams from our home. Let's focus on the knowledge creation altogether. And it changed the way they worked as a team long term, I think, as a result of that. Any final commentary on addressing bottlenecks and how it plays into the PI plan? Moving to the third flow accelerator, minimize handoffs and dependencies. I think it's my turn in rotation. I'll take this one because it's like the easy and obvious one for PI planning. We just spent 2 days creating visibility into all the dependencies. Why don't we get rid of them? Okay, there's my summary of the flow accelerator. PI planning is the place where you have, frankly, the most visibility. So that becomes the time when you can use that visibility to identify opportunities. And I did a coach in the coach last week. One of the things I realized in there was that improvement takes real work. A lot of times we look at these and it's like, oh, we can just hand wave or change a policy or whatever. But eliminating dependencies takes investment. And PI planning is the place you plan at. It's like, yes, we could satisfy this dependency by iteration 2, or we could get rid of it forever by iteration 3 if we implement this, and this. Now that's a business trade-off. That starts to look like, wow, this team's a bottleneck on a regular basis. If you finally build that wrapper and do shared source on that wrapper, then you just enable the front-end team to do 90% more of the work. Yeah, we'll take an extra 10 days to do that. It's phenomenal. And those are some of the things that I've seen come out of PI planning. When we see all the string, it's like, how do we cut the string? Where does it go wrong? Where do people mess this up?
The one thing I've seen, and it's common in all environments, not just when people use safe, is that they sort of lie to themselves that they don't have dependencies and handoffs. They tell stories about the work, where the work looks like it's independent, but it's not really independent, making it harder to actually see these dependencies, but they're there. Actually, CPI planning is one of the best ways to flush out these behaviors, but it's not perfect. So if people are not really into visualizing the handoffs and dependencies and getting rid of them, you might still, live in the watermelon mode where people are saying, yeah, we'll be fine. We don't need anybody. For example, if people are told dependencies are bad, if people need to, pay a price for red yarn, then probably what will happen is that they'll tell a story that they don't need red yarn. I've seen that. So
wonder if a ribbon cutting ceremony would help. Like, actually have a ceremony where you literally cut the yarn and celebrate it at some point during the PI.
But that would mean that people are really willing, and they're also trained before we go into those PI plannings, to look for those handoffs and dependencies that you really can minimize, and then proactively plan like that. Or you raise the indicators so that after PI planning, you can deal with it during the PI execution and be more specific for the preparation of the next PI planning, right? Where you then might have a different slicing of teams, a different setup, so that you really minimize those handoffs and dependencies. And when I'm talking and teaching RTEs, I always say, you not only should have a strategy for coaching, you should also have a strategy to go where you see those handoffs and dependencies and talk to the teams, talk to those who are hanging at those dependencies and handoffs. How could you improve that during execution? And also looking forward to the next few PIs, looking forward to the big picture, right?
As you're talking, Stephan, I'm thinking of the opposite anti-pattern to what I've described. I do see cases where people feel like it's actually good to have those dependencies. It's actually their job to manage dependencies, right? For example, the RTE that comes from classic program management, it's almost like, you know, I'm losing the word, the arsonist firefighter. You almost, you know, have the situation where people, you know, are proud about their, you know, tons of dependencies. They share their, you know, cool art boards. They bought a cool, you know, tool to manage the dependencies on the board. So it's actually good that we have these dependencies and we don't really need to do anything about them other than manage them on an ongoing basis, which justifies our, you know, our position and the fact that we have a job. I've seen that more often than I'd like to admit.
It's easy to paint that picture and treat that as a negative behavior, like there's ill intent attached to it. But there's also, I think, just a habit of getting comfortable with such things. And we get comfortable with the way teams work together, and we're comfortable with the way the system is. And suddenly we don't notice the soup we're swimming in anymore. And this is just the way things are. And some of those people that you might point out and say, oh, they like these dependencies because it's their job to manage. I've talked to some people who hate that part of their job. And they see themselves as the heroes for dealing with it on behalf of everybody else, but they would be so happy if it was gone in a minute. But they never think about it possible to let it go away.
Yeah, I second that. What you said, Yuval. So it's a social system, right? And me hanging on to this job as an RTE, to being proud about my art, right? And now probably minimizing handoffs and dependencies would show a different slicing, like reducing an art, reducing some teams, having different teams, and that will affect me if I'm in that thinking that you just described, right? So coming back to what Eric said, observing not only what happens between the people, how they plan, how they come up with the dependency, stuff like that. It's also observing people per se. We have to invest in that system as well.
Especially because it doesn't necessarily mean all dependencies are bad either. I mean, it's easy for us to look at it as a coach and be like, this is bad. But let's remember, let's pull out the same maxim you quoted earlier, value trumps flow trumps waste. And I may actually, in some cases, get greater overall value having all my specialists concentrated because they're more innovative in their narrow space, even though that creates dependencies that slows down the training a little bit. Maybe it's also allowing them to create the optimizations that accelerate the business to a level that we couldn't if that expertise was dispersed and not learning from each other.
Yeah, I guess the key point here, maybe to summarize, is you want to be aware to visualize the need for handoffs and dependencies throughout PI planning. You want to apply systems thinking and an economic view to what kind of dependencies make sense to manage effectively. What kind of dependencies do you want to start thinking about eliminating? It says minimize on purpose. It's minimize rather than eliminate. And it's a trade-off. Whatever architecture you create, there are going to be some dependencies. The only question is what kind of dependencies are easier to manage and have better overall economics. PI planning is a tool to have these conversations. As long as you're thinking about these principles as you're looking at your plan for the PI, that's the important thing.
Maybe I'm transitioning to the next flow accelerator of getting faster feedback in a certain way. Yuval, I think we're around to you. How does that show up in PI planning? This might be a particularly fun one for you because when you couple that with the idea that it's this big, long period of time and you're talking about months, how does that align to getting faster feedback to accelerate flow?
I mean, one perspective of faster feedback is you're getting early feedback of what might happen in the PI. That's good, right? You hopefully anticipate some stuff that would happen throughout the PI, and you have an opportunity to make some changes before things really happen. The other side of this is that there are some decisions that we're making in PI planning that we won't have fast feedback on because they are going to happen later on. Or we would have limited feedback on. We would have feedback from other teams on our plans, but it will take time until those plans come to fruition. And it might be, tempting to try to think through and give all the feedback that we can right now up front about something. But in many cases, the right choice is to say, okay, we know there might be some surprises there. We'll get that feedback when we get to it. Let's not try to front load too much.
Yeah, the question for me, you want fast feedback for alignment and decision making. That's the 2 points I'm after when I do teaching, coaching. The question is, how do you get access to this information in a big room? Or even if you are distributed or in a hybrid situation, how do you create this platform that you have fast access so that you can align and then you can decide in a fast way, right? We talk about faster feedback, but how do you get there during PI planning?
See as the social network element of PI planning is kind of building the connections that allow you to make quick decisions when you're able to, which is ideally the moment the information arrives. And that involves a little bit of playing out the experiments and almost wargaming them in a certain way of saying, here's how what do we do? What will we do if we learn this? What will we do if we learn this? And some of them are obvious, and some of them are harder to predict the outcomes or even to categorize the likely outcomes. But I find when you start to get teams and product leaders having those conversations during PI planning, things that used to be, it's the difference between an emergence and an emergency during the actual PI. Like, the things come up, cool, we already know how we're going to handle them. We've already, not scripted the response, but we already know which 3 people are going to get together, have the conversation, and move on, instead of it becoming 2 weeks of scheduled meetings. We've already looked at this experiment we're running by having 2 teams playing with different UI frameworks to see which one's better. And we already pre-made the decision that the 2 teams plus an arbiter will get together, evaluate the results after one iteration, and both teams will use the new and the rest of the PI. Done. We've incorporated feedback and we've made ourselves capable of using it. So that's the way I look at this one, as getting ready for flow. It's getting ready to handle feedback quickly.
That again will mean if you socialize features, if you socialize before PI planning, you're not only socializing content, you also should, what you just raised as wargaming, coming up with kind of scenarios, what will we probably face when we do the collaboration, when we start talking about different options. And then again, coming back to what you mentioned earlier, who could observe from the outside, who could coach, who could guide that, who could facilitate that. And I see that for example, in such cases, not only an RTE or the triad is doing their job, also business owners, right? It's about alignment, fast decision making regarding effectiveness that we can deliver value. And if you want to deliver value, first of all, you have to plan and then generate the value to deliver the value.
I guess for me, beyond the wargaming, what really resonated in what you're saying, Eric, is not just the social fabric. We talked about it, in one of the last episodes, that PI planning is so important in creating the fabric, the connections between people that you can then leverage when things emerge. So it's not necessarily something you do in PI planning explicitly, it's the whole experience that sets you up for getting faster feedback and doing something about it rather than being panicked about it or ignoring it because you don't know how to talk to each other and you're back to the schedule cheating game.
Saying that it just reminded me, and I just pulled up an old talk, Scaling the Social Fabric of Agility, that I did in 2015. Might have been 2014. And it's interesting, it's the first time the first quote is Lencioni's quote on organizational health. And then on the next slide is the prompt question in this talk: who does your process serve? Which starts to come back to what we're talking about now in a big way. It's if our goal is to create flow, does everything we have in place around PI planning serve to help people get more ready to create flow over the PI? And if it's not serving that purpose, we should inspect it and adapt it. But we need to inspect and adapt towards the right goal for people, which is to create flow and spend the company's money wisely, not make them happy and comfortable, just even if they're less efficient or whatever. But with the right goal in mind, of course, adapt your process, adapt everything to create flow. I know the graphics in this little talk. I'm not going to share them, but so with that, any other mistakes or tangents you see people going down around faster feedback that are worth addressing?
I'm imagining the curve of diminishing returns at this point.
Good conversation, or people ever seeking more feedback?
Yes.
Perfect. Now with that, let's take a little bit of time back from our pacing and dig into the really big one, I say with irony, working in smaller batches. So let's take a bigger batch of time to focus on working in smaller batches. Stephan, how does PI planning help us work in smaller batches?
That's where I sometimes struggle, because we are creating a big batch, right, for the next 8 to 12 weeks. Having said that, the preparation is a good phase to work in smaller batches already when you anticipate, when you socialize what's on the plate. And I see PI planning as a splendid occasion to even break it further down so that we have more maneuverability throughout the PI execution. The smaller the batches are, the better it goes. It's not only the size of stories and features, it's also what could be batch sizes transitioning through the flow of work. If you look at the Kanban systems, when you go into testing, applying WIP limits again. So that starts now tying back to some of the other flow accelerators again. And I like PI planning in respect to that one, working with smaller batches. But again, for me, it comes also back to training, teaching, coaching beforehand, that people like to work in smaller batches, because we have trained them for years and decades to work with huge projects, big batches, because we thought it's more economical. And now we are changing the system, and that has to evolve over the time.
Well, it sounds like at least one of the two of you treat a PI as being necessarily a big batch. Where have we fallen into that trap?
I think it comes back to what are the things that we do for the PI in a batch. So a PI is a PI. Okay, a PI is a set of iterations. The fact that we're deciding to plan an entire PI in one batch, that's a decision that, that we're making in SAFe. The SAFe's, one of SAFe's design principles is we look at the economic trade-off of what kind of overhead is it to bring a set of teams together? How often does it make sense to bring them together? That's one consideration. Another consideration is what's the downside of actually looking deeper into the queue, deeper into the backlog, and thinking about some things that would happen multiple iterations into the future. What are the upsides, actually? There are some things that we need to think about. Maybe there's a critical path, critical chain, some dependencies that if we defer talking about them to the last minute, it will be too late. Maybe there are some, there's some predictability that we need to provide, some insight we need to provide to the business. All of these factors in SAFe, come into this decision to plan a whole PI at some level in advance. That's, why I see PI planning as a big batch, and it's different than how it's done in other approaches, and it's very similar to, it's more similar to some of the other agile approaches than people are willing to admit. That's one other thing that we can talk about. But, regardless, it's an economic choice. The important thing for me and where it goes wrong is when people misunderstand that economic choice and think that they need to plan this entire PI at a level of detail that doesn't make sense. PI planning is not iteration planning. It's looking at a high level, as we discussed some of the other times, getting ready to do the PI and figuring out stuff you need to figure out right now while deferring, preserving options for things that might emerge throughout the PI.
Yeah, because I think it's important to highlight that we're talking about working in smaller batches, not planning in any particular batch size, or I could say, I don't want to budget in smaller batches. I actually want to budget in bigger batches that I then draw down without having to friction. And the speed of change becomes a pretty important concern around that. But the batch size of working and the batch size of planning aren't the same thing to me. And if I shape out directionally 6 iterations worth of goals and have high levels 13-point, 8-point stories to kind of block out how I anticipate going about them, that doesn't create, to me, that's not very wasteful. Because even if things change, you're only moving around 5 or 7 artifacts per team per iteration. But to your point, if you've already broken that down into 2 and 1-point stories, suddenly I'm moving around 40 artifacts per team per iteration, and any shift to the plane feels very painful because I've got too much refinement in my plan, which makes it hard to change. So when I start to look at that, I said, I want bigger things in my planning as long as I've teased out the dependencies and risks, and smaller things for the actual work. And I treat those as 2 very distinct things.
It's all going back to the Agile Onion, right? SAFe didn't invent the Agile Onion. SAFe didn't invent release planning. We were doing release planning before there was SAFe, right?
Mhm.
And release planning is the old name for PI planning for those of us that weren't around at the time, right? It used to be called release planning, I believe, in wave 2, 3. And over time, we understood that it needs to be decoupled. You know, it's not that we plan a release, we plan work, we plan development, but it's not a practice that Safe invented. We've been trying to balance these, you know, the friction of getting people together, the overhead of the collaboration versus the value of the collaboration for a while. And the important thing is for people to remember they have choices and they need to figure out the right batch size for each activity rather than bundling all of it together. The fact that we're doing PI planning doesn't mean we need to plan, you know, all of the work that would happen in the PI.
I'm coming back to, if you socialize the feature candidates, if you socialize what you will talk about in PI planning, and applying work in smaller batches would mean for me then, throughout those 2 to 3 days during PI planning, having smaller entities where we focus on different aspects, like as soon as we have those dependencies, as soon as we see bottlenecks, as soon as we see some indication, can we break it down into smaller batches, having faster decision making, come to a conclusion where we say, okay, that's good enough as a high level estimate to then put it on our team plans, on the R planning board, and then move to the next one. And like that, iterating through PI planning. But that would then tell me we probably would have a different agenda on day 1 and on day 2, iterating in smaller batches through the planning process. And that's what goes through my mind, and that's probably one of the options how you could evolve the agenda of this 2 to 3 day planning to then reach a certain level of, yes, we have a set of committed PI objectives at the end of those 3, 4, 5 iterations of smaller batches. At the moment, we have 2 big batches, day 1, day 2, with different goals. Day 1, surface the stuff, have a management review meeting. And I would like to see that more often during a PI planning, not waiting and delaying stuff, because that's a big batch, day 1, and you come to conclusion at the end of day 1. You come to the business value assignment on day 1. That's, for me, 2 iterations, 2 big batch sizes.
Process of you describing that, either, I don't know if it's actually an officially named technique, but saturation planning or swarm planning at the iteration level, where you kind of pull up a story and ask who can work on this, and get that group takes that story, goes off and plans, they develop the next story, and whoever's left can start to pick up pieces of that. I've never done that at a PI level explicitly. I've done little bits of it at like 5 or 6 team scale. I'm curious what that would look like as an iterative approach to decompose the objectives and let teams pick them up and run with them, and then whatever teams aren't working on that works is the second highest priority, and see how far down the backlog you get before teams start to tap out.
For me, that relates to our next one, reduce queue length.
Ooh, so let's use that. You just volunteered, I think. Go for it.
Yeah. So if we talk about queues, one of the queues that I see often in PI planning is the queue of features that a team has taken from the art backlog and is planning to plan. And if you look at that level, they are probably focusing on the first feature, the first objective, and there's another objective that's currently assigned to that team, is sitting in the team's planning queue, but they're not working on it yet. They might work on it later on in this breakout, hopefully, or they might at some point figure out that they cannot. But while it's in the queue, we're not taking advantage of the fact that there might be other teams that could also tackle that feature. So as you're talking about that swarming technique, Eric, I'm recalling, times where on purpose we didn't let teams take, too many features, take just one feature and, come back to the art backlog when you have the capacity to take on another feature. And in this way, by the way, you're reinforcing, limiting the amount of work in process. It kind of encourages them to load as much stuff from this feature to their earlier iterations. And it also reminds me of the time that as the product manager from hell in PI planning simulation, I kind of front load and give teams too many features that I know they won't be able to actually address, and seeing whether what they do with it. Definitely an anti-pattern. Don't do that in real life.
It's in some ways you're going back to the old Scrum coaching approach of if a team just isn't delivering, you give them one story and say, when you prove you can deliver one story, we'll let you plan two.
Yeah. And by the way, sometimes it's so natural to work this way. A lot of times you see teams that have affinity to certain features in the art backlog. I would say more often than not, when you look at the feature in the art backlog, you kind of know which team is the natural usual suspects team to take that feature, and they've socialized that feature. They've even refined it. They kind of know it's theirs to the point that it's at the risk of creating a queue and taking away options for other teams to actually help. And sometimes you need to intervene at that point and point it out and, ask explicitly, is there an option to do something different?
Starting it now with a lower number. So where does this go wrong? This is a good one to maybe dig into, because I think this is one where treating the longer term roadmap as a queue is already at risk. And sometimes that roadmap's assumptions cascade directly to PI planning without being reconsidered.
I guess like you're saying, it's a direct mapping. If we consider the PI plan as a queue, let's call it the British queuing approach, not the Israeli queuing approach, there would be less openness to disrupting the flow if something really interesting comes about. And you want to have a plan for the PI that enables you to take advantage of emerging opportunities, welcome change if it maximizes value for the business or the customer, and all that good stuff.
Mark's not here, but he has some notes on the board. I'm gonna just read one of them that's really worth paying attention to here. Is the story should not be a queue, but common anti-pattern is to treat them as one. And I think we do get in a habit of whatever elements we actually plan, we treat that level of planning as the commitment rather than the objectives or the dependency resolutions as a step below the objectives.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier the difference between, war rooming, wargaming, sandbox, simulations. We need to start to treat PI planning more like those war game simulations, what if scenarios, rather than commitments to plans. The fact that it looks like a queue shouldn't mean that it is a queue. Is there a way to improve how the plans look and how we actually run PI planning to generate a better metaphor in people's head to make it clear that it shouldn't be a queue? I see that as an area for future work.
And that's where
Mark is also providing comments in the stream that we might want to take a look at.
Yeah, I just noticed that, speaking of Mark, you've been feeding things over the last, looks like 2 or 3 principles, including a random +1 for that, and a handful of other things, but it also looks like he's on about a 4-minute delay by the time, delay/lag by the time he gets it. So he's talking about some interesting trade-off decisions, some highlights about dependency clusters being culturally driven by a team or shared service. And we're talking about the heroes of dependencies. So I think we're going to not try to integrate his comments into the flow right now. Instead, go to perhaps every developer's favorite, but also this is one that I feel like can be used as an excuse too often. Optimize time in the zone. I guess this was actually my turn, so I'll just jump right on top of that. One of the things I asked during PI plan especially, so the flow accelerator itself is quite obvious in how to apply during the PI, which is let's just stop interrupting people and create the conditions for them to get longer, more effective focus times. How to lay the groundwork for that during PI planning and as distinct from during the INA sessions gets really interesting to me. Like, can we look at reducing feature WIP on a per team basis by reshuffling the plan a little bit so that they're in the zone on one thing for longer, even though that's maybe not optimal for dependencies? Or can we shift team member composition so that they can be in the zone and like preempt a dependency through a temporary reassignment by moving a developer who knows another code base and has permission to modify that code. And even though that creates a little disruption to the team structure, lets the team as a whole stay in the zone and move faster with fewer external interruptions. So that's where I start to think about in the zone is how do we create the conditions to stay in the zone if we recognize that time in the zone is one of the biggest drivers of flow. Productivity.
Build on that. Do we have people who are in multiple teams? That's definitely a time in the zone killer. Whether those people are team members, whether those people are product owners, scrum masters, team coaches, all of these might be economic trade-offs that make sense, but at the minimum, we should be thinking about what would time in the zone look like for different roles, different individuals. It's a conversation that the team should maybe have during their breakout as part of risk reduction. How would time in the zone look like for us? Maybe even chart it out like we do in a retrospective, chart out the focus, the happiness, sustainable pace throughout the PI. Scrum Master team coach should have that conversation.
It's awesome. I'm good. Good.
It's interesting to listen to you guys. For me, time in the zone in PI planning is not only time in the zone during the breakout session as a team, dealing with the dependencies. We teach them to then plan the stories and then summarize again as objectives, because time in the zone for me also will be how do you get an overall alignment, bringing the teams out of the time in the zone in the team to time in the zone as a team of agile team. And for me, that's actually in a PI planning. I don't see that quite often unless you foster it, unless you bring people together proactively, or they do it. And I would like to have time in the zone as a team of agile teams as well during PI planning.
Can you give an example of where that goes wrong, just to help me kind of connect to it? Give me an example of a team of agile teams that's not in the zone.
Yeah, for example, if you want to have some swarming around some options and not just relying on a leading team and some supporting teams regarding the dependencies, right? How do you swarm around a certain topic during a certain time during the breakout sessions? And that's actually not for me, it's not in the agenda. It's let the teams plan, let's come up with the dependencies, summarize as draft PI objectives, then have the planning adjustments and come up with the final plan.
For me, another altitude of time in the zone is indeed time in the zone during PI planning itself, not thinking about the PI, but thinking about PI planning. For example, we discussed, the trade-off between context sessions, which I would struggle to consider. Most art members would not define that as time in the zone from their perspective. There's added value in that time, but the team would like to, do the minimum viable context that makes sense for them, and then go and plan as a team. At the risk of actually focusing too much on time in the zone, that they don't come out of their shell and don't come and talk to other teams. I think Eric pointed out to that risk, but the balance between teams breaking out, bringing them together, the trade-off there, for me, that's another thing to think about as you're designing and inspecting and adapting your PI plan.
So when I listen to this, I actually hesitate to look at teams' time in the zone for PI planning. I would look at the system of the train. And I actually would consider an anti-pattern for the teams to be focused on their time in zone if the delivery level and the planning level is there. Because this would be time and zone for the art to get together and use that scarce time that it has in ways that aren't always available or easy depending on your travel arrangements and dynamics and everything else.
I see what you're saying. I guess my fear here is I can see how people would abuse that or what I'm wondering is, how do I leverage that concept to make sure that shared time at the art level is used effectively? Like, is one person standing in front of the train hashing out details that they don't necessarily need to hash out at that time? How do I use the time in the zone concept to reflect on, are we using that time effectively?
That's like opposite of zone to me. That's one person in the zone and everybody else not. But if I look at that from how's PI planning operating, like in the moment, like in the zone as an art is a lot of flow back and forth between teams during team breakouts. It's two teams morphing into one big blob and acting like one team while they sort out their dependencies on a complicated area of the plan. And things that are anything that gets in the way of that kind of in the zone fluid behavior concerns me, including large room conversations with 800 people listening to 4 people talk.
And teams in their different breakout rooms and not talking to each other. Both of these are extremes that don't work, right?
And that's actually, I think, some of my personal hardest challenge with the pure remote planning or the hybrid planning is the need for teams to have their own space. Like that's one of the things I miss the most over in-person planning, where I can put the teams in a circle around the outer side of the bigger group. Because the fluidity, like that's where I see the not face-to-face causing the most harm. There's been various apps over the years that try to duplicate physical space, like Go, and I think Wheelo was the last one to go out, but I don't know, I haven't seen any cut that scale.
Yep.
And that's where I see the challenge, right? Local optimization versus global optimization. What's the goal? It's alignment on a team of agile teams, finally. How do you get there? Probably not. I'm being very, a bit aggressive, not having just 2 breakout sessions where you can fall back into local optimization. So how do we probably find other stages, other forms? But again, I wouldn't prescribe it. It's dependent on, if I look at the feature candidates, if I look at the business context, what's the challenge for the oncoming PI? And that starts with business context, that starts with the feature candidates, and that then should drive how we design the different rounds or breakout sessions. And sometimes you might only need 2, sometimes you might need 4 or 5 over 2 days to reach a conclusion. What is alignment and what is a good enough high-level estimate plan that then helps the team to come up with the team PI objectives, which I really find helpful. But again, team PI objectives is not the ultimate goal. It's the overall alignment. And in our teaching, in our trainings, we say, yeah, after PI planning, we might summarize the TM PI objectives as ART objectives. I see so many arts not doing that, not having this overall ART PI objective, which serves as the business summary and the alignment.
I never saw that as a might. I always treated that as a must because that's one of my primary status reporting tools for the arts throughout the PI.
I fully agree, Eric, but I've seen so many trainers not doing it, leaving PI planning. Yes, we have reached a conclusion. These are the committed sets of PI objectives. Let's start, right? And after a day after PI planning, already losing again this alignment.
Use that maybe as a transition to number 8, the great permission giver of remediate legacy policies and practices. Now let me put in parentheses there, including those that originate in Scrum, Kanban, SAFe, etc. So if our goal is to create flow, I'll grab, I guess, the intro on this one to wrap. If our goal is to create flow, so that we're creating value for our customers, then anything that gets in the way of that, that comes from elsewhere, is at that point legacy. It is something that is impeding you from achieving your goals that may have been incredibly useful in the past. I don't want to diminish its history. But legacy policies and legacy practices are things that are no longer applicable, valuable, and useful to you today. And therefore should be removed either immediately with inspection to make sure we're not breaking something in the process, or taken the need for them eliminated by investing during the PI, fixing that subsystem, better logging, whatever it is to create the environment where the policy or practice can go away, to remove a bottleneck, to simplify things, whatever it looks like. I used to teach this as zombie processes. It was my language for it. It's like, if you see a zombie process, make sure it's dead, and then shoot it in the head. And step 1, make sure it's not serving a vital governance function, because some of them are, and you just aren't aware of it. But once you've checked on it, like, let it go and move on. And unfortunately, I think this is one of the biggest anti-patterns I see, is people are loath to do this or inattentive to the permission and ability to do so.
You captured it well, Eric. I don't know that I have much to add other than included in that legacy is what SAFe has to say about PI planning. And as long as you're thinking about the principles, both principle 6 as well as the other principles we're covering, everything is fair game, right? If something is affecting your ability to flow or your ability to bring to life any of the other SAFe principles, experiment with how could I do things differently while remembering the principles. The principles are there to help make sure you don't, throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Let's amplify that with, and remember the goal. Higher value to your customer and service to higher profits or value to your company. Higher flow in delivering new value to the customer. Higher flow in your ability, like, to plan and all the different other things that flow into creating better flow of value to your customer. And kind of think about what's the path to your customer, what's downstream of everything you do. And maybe, I don't know if this is still true by the time we look at last Nexus and other things, but for a long time, the biggest differentiator for me between SAFe and Scrum, like the Columbus Scrum teams working together, was SAFe explicitly makes the program the priority and subordinates the teams to the program, whereas Scrum arguably did the opposite. And we need to make sure we're looking at value at the right level and creating flow at the right level. And if we're doing that, any practice we do that achieves that, that passes the, I think it was the Mike code test, how's that working for you? Is probably a positive practice. That's breaking something else. 60-second round robin, final thoughts. Let's go first.
I liked the discussion again, and if I might wrap it up from my perspective, know your goal, then focus on the way to get there, have enough options, and if you are at the goal, or if you reach your target, know the state you're expected to be in. And that, for me, Eric, as you said, it's not about the team, it's about the team of agile teams. How do you align? And PI planning should serve that 100%.
For me, the theme today was trade-offs, understanding the trade-offs between different things. Understanding those trade-offs for me is key to any safe practitioner that's looking at the PI and PI planning. We also applied the flow principle and the flow accelerators both to PI planning itself as well as the PI execution, and I think that's another useful lens. And I also liked, as usual, the stories and the tips and things that I'll try to do. And it's good to feel there are more members of the I'm an Agile coach and I use Gantt charts club.
All the Gantt charts, because most modern Agilists don't remember them, but they're a boogeyman now more than anything. I think my biggest one, and I've said it a couple times during this, but I'm going to keep beating the drum because 7 times, and the sheer importance of this is PI planning is your opportunity to prepare to create flow. And if you're not doing whatever it takes to create an environment by the end of PI planning where the arch is ready to flow for the next 4 to 10 to however long you decide to plan your PI weeks, then you're not achieving the real outcomes of PI planning. And these days talk about that as the social network and the alignment and all that. But really, flow as a concept that bundles all of that up to say, is this complex social creation we built ready to flow? Or not? And if so, we've been successful, even if it was bumpy along the way and the temperature wasn't right and the food was horrible and whatever other complaints. Retrospective findings we see. So, with that, everybody, thank you for listening. I know we have at least one live listener out there, and I look forward to comments from other people besides Mark. Thank you, and next week we will pick up with Principle 7, and maybe get through the rest of the principles. So thank you, everybody.